After Urban came Gregory XI, the last French pope. He moved the papacy from Avignon, France, back to Rome, partly at the behest of St. Catherine of Vienna, who believed it was important that the papacy be in Rome. After Gregory died, the College of Cardinals assembled to elect a new pope in Rome, and a mob broke out to urge them to elect an Italian. They elected the Italian Urban VI, but soon regretted that decision, especially after Urban began preaching at them and condemning their lavish lifestyles. The French cardinals then elected anti-Pope Clement, who reigned from Avignon. Pope Urban died after falling from his mule one day. Following him came Boniface IX. During his reign, anti-Pope Clement died and was replaced by anti-Pope Benedict. The French cardinals and this anti-papacy was under the protection of the French king. Boniface was supported by England, Germany, Hungary, and Poland, but the rest of Europe supported the anti-pope. Boniface was even encouraged to step down to resolve the mess of competing claims, but he didn't, and eventually died, and was replaced by Innocent VII, who promised to resolve the schism between the Roman papacy and the Avignon anti-papacy by convening a council. But because this would probably involve both him and the anti-pope stepping down, he decided not to call a council. Eventually, after Innocent died, Gregory XII was elected under the condition that if the anti-pope renounced all claims to the papacy, that Gregory would as well, so that a fresh election could be had and finally end the schism. Anti-Pope Alexander and then Anti-Pope John reigned during Gregory's papacy. Eventually, the schism was resolved with the Council of Constance, in which both Pope Gregory and Anti-Pope Alexander resigned. The council exercised papal power for 2 years, until the previous papal claimants died. And then they elected Martin V, who quickly reasserted the supremacy of the Pope, after the recent conciliar movement had seen papal power shared among many. After Martin, Eugene IV was elected, and was successful in recreating the supremacy that the papacy had had before the schism. He was also a lover of art and learning, and re-established the university at Rome. After Eugene came Nicholas V, under whose pontificate the capital of the Byzantine Empire, Constantinople, fell to the Ottoman Turks. Nicholas was a key figure of the Roman Renaissance. He prompted arts and literature. He strengthened and restored Rome's fortifications, aqueducts, and churches. He wanted to beautify Rome to make it worthy of being the capital of the Christian world. He ordered the design plans for a new church that would eventually become St. Peter's Basilica. After Nicholas came Calixtus III, the first Spanish pope. He was a part of the powerful Borgia family. His main concern was protecting the European Christian world from a possible invasion by the Turks. The European kings hardly listened to the Pope's concerns, however, since they were more concerned about their inter-European national rivalries. Calixtus also elevated his nephew, Rodrigo de Borgia, to a cardinal. He would later become Pope Alexander VI, infamous for his corruption and immorality. After Calixtus came Pius II. He proclaimed a new crusade against the Ottomans, which failed. There just wasn't enough morale among the people to go fight a new crusade, especially without the support of the princes of Europe. After Pius came Paul II. Soon after his election, he lost the confidence of the cardinals, and he became paranoid, secretive, and inaccessible even to his friends. After Paul came Sixtus IV, who commissioned the Sistine Chapel and the Vatican archives. He also renewed the call for a crusade against the Ottoman Turks. Then Innocent VIII, whose tomb has a mysterious inscription which says, "During his pontificate, the glory of the discovery of a new world." But he died a week before Christopher Columbus even left for his supposed first voyage. Some people are now convinced that Columbus's first voyage was earlier than the date we normally think of. After Innocent came the infamous Rodrigo de Borgia, who took the name Alexander VI, elected in the conclave of 1492, which is said to have been a particularly expensive campaign. Alexander made many alliances to secure his election. Cardinal Giovanni di Lorenzo de' Medici, who would later become Pope Leo X, reportedly said of Alexander's election, "Now we are in the power of a wolf, the most rapacious perhaps that this world has ever seen, and if we do not flee, he will inevitably devour us all." Alexander used his power to provide for his children and set up his family for political success. He did start one religious tradition still in use today. In the Jubilee of 1500, he began the custom of opening a holy door at Rome's basilicas and passing through the threshold as a symbol of the church entering into a period of penance and reconciliation. Next, Pius III died after 26 days. Then Julius II, who on the day of his election declared, "I will not live in the same rooms as the Borgias lived." He, Alexander VI, desecrated the Holy Church as none before. He usurped the papal power by the devil's aid, and I forbid under the pain of excommunication anyone to speak or think of Borgia again. His name and memory must be forgotten. It must be crossed out of every document and memorial. His reign must be obliterated. All paintings made of the Borgias or for them must be covered over with black. All the tombs of the Borgias must be opened and their bodies sent back to where they belong, to Spain. During Julius's pontificate, he commissioned Michelangelo to paint the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel. After Julius came Leo X. Under his pontificate, the Protestant Reformation began. He is best remembered for granting indulgences to those who donated to rebuild St. Peter's Basilica, and excommunicating Martin Luther, who criticized this sale of indulgences. After Leo came Adrian VI, the only Dutch pope, and the last non-Italian pope until Pope John Paul II, some 455 years later. He acknowledged the need for reform in response to the Protestant Reformation, although he didn't fully understand the gravity of the situation. Then, under Clement XII, the English Reformation began, when Henry VIII sought to have his marriage to Catherine annulled, and the Pope denied the request. The Archbishop of Canterbury, Thomas Cranmer, was prepared to grant the annulment, and Henry married Anne Boleyn. The Pope excommunicated both Henry and Cranmer. Ultimately, this led to the Supremacy Act from Parliament, which declared that the monarch was the head of the English Church and not the Pope. Next, Pope Paul III convened the Council of Trent to realize a counter-reformation in response to the Protestant Reformation. It defined and declared as heresies many of the ideas of Protestantism, as well as clarifying the doctrines and teachings of the Catholic Church, and abuses and corruptions within the Church were condemned and prohibited. Then Julius III's pontificate harmed the reputation of the Church, which needed reform. Among his more notable scandals was his rumored romantic relationship with his adoptive nephew, Innocenzo, whom he had made a cardinal, although he was completely unprepared for the job. After Julius came Marcellus II, who died within 22 days of becoming pope. Then Paul IV, who still had to deal with the Protestant Reformation and the fact that there were now Protestant monarchs in Europe. Paul, for his part, rejected as illegitimate any Protestant monarch, and specifically in England, supported the claim of Philip and Mary as King and Queen of England, which saw England return to Catholicism for a short period before Elizabeth I took the throne and reversed this. In order to crack down on the spread of Protestantism, censorship reached new heights, and Paul created the Index Liborum Prohibitorum, the list of prohibited books, which Catholics were not allowed to read. This list existed in one form or another until it was abolished in 1966, some 400 years later. Paul was also a hardened anti-Semite. He ordered the creation of a Jewish ghetto that was walled off from the rest of the city. He allowed only one synagogue to remain open in Rome and ordered that the other 7 be destroyed. Jews were forced to wear yellow hats, and people were encouraged to treat them as second-class citizens. Although Paul's pontificate lasted only 5 years, the anti-Semitism he inflamed lasted for hundreds of years. The Jewish ghetto he created only stopped existing in 1870, some 300 years later. Then came Pius IV, then Pius V, who excommunicated Queen Elizabeth I for heresy and for persecuting Catholics in England. He also ushered in reforms like standardizing the Catholic Mass by making mandatory across the entire Church what came to be called the Tridentine Mass. This Mass remained largely unchanged until the Mass of Paul VI in 1969, which is now the ordinary form of Catholic Masses. However, the Tridentine Mass, now called the Extraordinary Form, can still be seen in some more traditional Catholic churches. Then came Gregory XIII, who commissioned the correction of the Julian calendar, and thus the development of the Gregorian calendar we use today, named after him. The Catholic countries in Europe quickly switched over to the new Gregorian calendar, while the Protestant and Eastern Orthodox countries slowly moved over throughout the next 3 centuries. After Gregory came Sixtus V. He was strict in rooting out corruption and lawlessness in Rome. He levied heavy taxes to spend on public works and repairs in Rome. It is said of him that he slept little and worked hard. He had inherited a bankrupt treasury, but at his death, the treasury was full, and the streets of Rome were improved. Then came Urban VII, who banned smoking in church and threatened anyone with excommunication who would bring tobacco even near a church. And as a help to the poor, he subsidized bakers so that they could sell bread cheap. Then came Gregory XIV, who after his election cried out, "God forgive you for what you have done." Apparently he had a disposition for nervous laughter, which manifested itself at his coronation. Then came Innocent IX, then Clement VIII, who legend has it was once being urged to denounce coffee as Satan's drink because of its popularity with the Muslims, but after tasting it, he apparently said, "This Satan's drink is so delicious it would be a pity to let the infidels have exclusive use of it." Then Leo XI was elected and died 27 days later. Then Paul V, who established the Bank of the Holy Spirit, the first national bank in Europe, serving as the bank for the Papal States. He also supported Galileo in his discoveries and use of the heliocentric model of the universe. Paul assured him that as long as he lived, Galileo would be safe from persecution. Then Gregory XV was elected, followed by Urban VIII, who summoned Galileo to Rome to recant his work, and ordered his second trial. Then came Innocent X and Alexander VII, and Clement IX and X, who canonized the first saint from the Americas, Saint Rose of Lima. Then Innocent XI, a more conservative pope, who abolished gambling, theaters, and passed strict rules on how Roman women could dress. He also lowered taxes and was frugal in administration. Then Alexander VIII. Then Innocent XII, who came out hard against nepotism in the church. He prohibited future popes from bestowing on their relatives any title, land, money, and at most allowed only one relative of the pope to become a cardinal if they were worthy of it. He is the last pope to have facial hair while in office. Then came Clement XI, who forbid Christian missionaries in China from participating in civil events that honored Confucius and other ancestors of the emperors of China. Then came Innocent XIII, then Benedict XIII, and Clement XII, the first pope to condemn Freemasonry, beginning the long-standing opposition of the Church to the Freemasons. Then came Benedict XIV, considered to be one of the best scholars to be pope. He wrote many theological and ecclesiastical treatises. He promoted the sciences and the arts, and re-excommunicated all Protestant sects. Then Clement XIII, who was so modest that he had the nudity of classical sculptures in the Vatican covered with fig leaves. Then Clement XIV, then Pius VI, who condemned the French Revolution and was expelled from the Papal States when Italy was invaded and his troops defeated by Napoleon. The Pope refused to renounce his temporal power, and so was taken prisoner and died in France. After his death, there was a period of 6 months without a pope, until finally Pope Pius VII was elected. He took a cautious approach to Napoleon. With him, he signed the Concordat of 1801, which guaranteed Catholics in France religious freedom. Pius was also present at Napoleon's coronation as Emperor of the French. However, during the Napoleonic Wars, Napoleon once again invaded Italy and expelled the Pope from the Papal States, but Pius returned after the French were defeated. Then Leo XII was elected, followed by Pius VIII, who declared that Catholics could marry Protestants as long as their children would be brought up Catholic. Then Gregory XVI, who, although progressive in condemning the slave trade, was very much a conservative who condemned democratization and modernization in Europe. Then Pius IX, who convened the First Vatican Council that declared the dogma of papal infallibility. That is to say, that the Pope is preserved from error when in the exercise of his office he defines a doctrine concerning faith or morals. The council was cut short because Pius lost most of the Papal States in 1861 to the Kingdom of Italy. Finally, in 1870, the entirety of Rome, except the Papal Palace, was taken over by Italy. And thus, for the first time in 1,000 years, the Pope had no Papal States under his control. He remained, as a matter of principle, a self-imposed prisoner in the Papal Palace. He and the next 3 popes refused to leave the palace so as to not give the impression that they accepted the authority of the Italian government. Pius was also the first pope to be photographed. Next came Pope Leo XIII, the first pope on film and the first to have his voice recorded. In his famous 1891 encyclical on the rights of workers, he outlined the right to a fair wage, safe working conditions, labor unions, while affirming the right to private property and free enterprise. His intellect and diplomacy managed to improve relations with the countries of Europe. He also came out in favor of the French Republic, which upset many conservative French monarchists. Then Pius X was elected. He was a simple man, but stern in his conservative convictions against modernism. He was less amiable with secular governments and organizations than his predecessor. He restored the prominence of Gregorian chant, encouraged daily communion, and even lowered the age of children's first communion from 12 to 7. He also directed the production of the 1917 Code of Canon Law, the first comprehensive codification of the legal system and laws of the Catholic Church, which was completed under his successor, Benedict XV, whose pontificate began shortly after World War I began, and as such the war was his main focus. He declared the neutrality of the Holy See, and from that stance tried to mediate peace. He was particularly appalled at the use of new aerial warfare, but having failed at mediating peace, he focused on humanitarian efforts. In particular, he urged the people and clergy of the United States to help him feed the children of war-torn countries in Europe. His generosity apparently drained the Vatican treasury by his large-scale charitable expenditures during the war. After Benedict came Pius XI. He signed the Lateran Treaty with Italy, which officially established Vatican City, and ended the self-imprisonment of the popes. Towards the end of his pontificate, he spoke out against Mussolini and Hitler. Then came Pius XII, under whose pontificate World War II began and ended. Although the Vatican was officially neutral, Pius maintained links to the German resistance against Hitler's Nazi regime. And although Catholic churches ended up saving many Jews, the Vatican remained publicly silent about the Holocaust, which was criticized by many. Next came Pope John XXIII. In 1958, he became the first pope since 1870 to make pastoral visits in Rome, visiting children in hospital and prisoners in prison. In the traditional Good Friday liturgy, there was a prayer that described the Jews as faithless. In 1960, Pope John removed that description. He wanted to reconcile the church with the Jewish people after centuries of anti-Semitism. It was the Pope's hope to modernize the church. In that vein, in 1962, he opened the Second Vatican Council, a meeting of bishops from across the world. He wanted to open the windows of the church and let in some fresh air. He did not live to see its end. His successor, Paul VI, saw its conclusion and the beginning of many changes for the Church, beginning with the liturgy, which was reformed from the traditional so-called Tridentine Mass to the Mass of Paul VI, still in use today. The local language of the people was allowed to be used instead of Latin, and the priest now faced the people. Outside of Mass, there was a renewed sense of ecumenism, dialogue between the Catholic Church and the other religions, and between the Holy See and other countries. Paul was the first pope to travel by airplane, the first to leave Italy since 1809, and the first to visit 5 continents: North and South America, Africa, Asia, and Oceania. Another notable thing about Paul VI was that he was the last pope to be crowned. In keeping with the spirit of the Second Vatican Council, Pope Paul, after his coronation, took off his papal tiara and laid it on the altar, as a sign of his renouncing human glory and power. The tiara was sold off and money given to a charity. The buyer arranged for it to be displayed in the Basilica of the National Shrine of the Immaculate Conception in Washington, D.C., as a gift to American Catholics. It is there to this day. Next came John Paul I, who opted for a simple inauguration mass instead of an elaborate coronation. He was the first pope to use 2 names, in honor of his immediate predecessors. He had a personal warmth about him, such that he was called the Smiling Pope. He did much to humanize the papacy in his very short time as pope, because he died in 33 days. His successor took the name John Paul II in his honor. He was the first non-Italian pope in 455 years, since Adrian VI in 1522. At 58 years old, he was the youngest pope to be elected since Pius IX in 1846. He traveled more than all of his successors combined, visiting 129 countries and meeting with many world leaders. He also canonized more saints than all of his predecessors. During his pontificate, he significantly improved relations with Jewish people, Muslims, and the Eastern Orthodox, and he apologized to many groups who had suffered at the hands of the church. In 1981, he was shot in St. Peter's Square while riding on the back of an unprotected popemobile. He lost 3/4 of his blood and required 5 hours of surgery. He promulgated the 1983 Code of Canon Law, still in use today, to replace the first code in 1917. He is credited for helping bring down communism in Central and Eastern Europe. He spoke out against apartheid and capital punishment. He supported the creation of the European Union, and in particular Poland's membership of the European Union. He criticized the Gulf War and the later Iraq War, saying that war is not inevitable and always a defeat of humanity, which destroys the lives of innocent people and leaves behind a trail of resentment and hatred. Finally, after a long pontificate, he died in 2005. His funeral mass broke records in general attendance and in number of heads of states present. There were 4 kings, 5 queens, some 70 presidents and prime ministers, and more than a dozen leaders of other religions. An estimated 4 million mourners gathered around Vatican City. In 2014, less than 10 years after his death, he was canonized a saint, the fastest canonization in modern history. After John Paul II came Benedict XVI, the oldest pope elected since Clement XII in 1730. In fact, before he was elected, he had hoped to retire soon, but he was elected. And as pope, he promoted the use of Latin and traditional papal vestments. He even allowed all priests to say the old Tridentine Mass, now called the extraordinary form of the Mass, in contrast to the ordinary form of the Mass of Paul VI, which is still the Mass usually seen today in Catholic churches. He resigned in 2013, citing his deteriorating strength, inconsistent with the physical and mental demands of the papacy. It was revealed later that he had had mild strokes and was fitted with a pacemaker before he became pope. And now Francis is pope, the first pope elected since Gregory III in 731 to be born outside of Europe. As an Argentinian, he was the first pope ever from the Americas and from the Southern Hemisphere, and the first pope to take a name that hadn't been used before since Pope Lando in 913. Surely there will be a lot of firsts for this pope, but this story is still being written. And that was a brief history, maybe not so brief, history of the popes.